Okay, here's a wild thought for you. What if therapy is actually bookkeeping? I know, it sounds cold and calculating, but stick with me. We're talking about a deeply human kind of accounting, a way of tracking what we owe each other, what we've given, and maybe most importantly, what's been completely ignored. Let's dive into this because this idea might just hold the key to debugging some of society's most persistent problems. And it all really boils down to one massive, kind of provocative question. What if our biggest social crises aren't actually moral failings at all? What if they're a form of financial crime? A massive accounting fraud where the costs are just hidden by dumping them onto the balance sheets of the most vulnerable people in our society.
To really understand how this works, we've got to go back in time to a pretty radical idea from a single therapist.
So this is Ivan Bussermany-Nagy. He was a psychiatrist and also a Holocaust survivor. And you can imagine that experience left him with this one profound question that drove his entire career. What do we owe each other? He came to believe the answer wasn't just some philosophical thing in our heads. It was more like an invisible record, a ledger that we all keep. Now, what's really fascinating when you look at how he developed this idea over time is that he wasn't just talking about abstract principles. Through these landmark books, he was building a real, concrete framework for tracking fairness, not just as a concept, but as a real, lived force that gets passed down through generations. He called it the ledger of justice. Just think of it like an invisible balance sheet that exists in every family, in every relationship. You earn merit when you give, care, sacrifice, support. You take on debt when you receive. Now, in healthy relationships, this ledger stays more or less balanced. But when it gets way out of whack, man, the consequences can ripple for generations. Okay, so let's bring this idea into the present day, because this is where a therapist's concept about families just explodes into a story about our entire society. Get this, decades after Nagy, a welfare practitioner in Japan, totally independently, comes up with the exact same accounting metaphor. He'd never even read Nagy's work. He just saw from his years of experience that the system wasn't just failing people, it was actually cooking the books. This is what's called a convergent discovery, and it's a huge clue that this metaphor isn't just clever, it's actually describing something real. And in Japan, they have a specific term for this kind of fraud, Tobashi. It literally means to make fly away. It's exactly what corporations like Enron did. They took their massive losses and bad debts and just made them fly away to some dummy company so they could look profitable. And this comparison perfectly illustrates the core argument. On one side, you have corporate Tobashi, hiding financial debt. And on the other, you have social Tobashi, where society hides its human debt. The cost of a bad policy, like underfunding a school, doesn't just disappear. It's a debt. And that debt gets moved somewhere else. So here's the crucial part, how the debt gets hidden. A systemic failure, a school's obligation to provide a real education, is moved off the public books and lands on a person's private internal ledger. But it doesn't look like a public debt anymore. It gets relabeled as a personal deficit, low self-esteem, lack of motivation, a character flaw. The system's debt becomes the individual's shame. So, if society's committing fraud, how do we perform an audit? How do we correct the books? You probably recognize this line, right? It's from the movie Good Will Hunting. And that moment is a near-perfect enactment of what Nagy called the first step in correcting the ledger. It's not just about being comforting, it's an auditor's statement, correcting a debt that was misattributed to the wrong person. And that leads us to this key concept, exoneration. Now, this is really important. This is not the same thing as forgiveness. Forgiveness often puts the burden on the victim to just let it go. Exoneration is different. It's liberation. It's that moment of realization, backed by evidence from the corrected ledger, that the debt you've been carrying your entire life was never yours to begin with. This all leads to a clear three-stage process for recovery. First, you correct the ledger for the past. Second, the person has that internal realization that it's not my fault moment in the present. And third, and this is absolutely critical, with a clean slate, they can now take full responsibility for their own future. It's not an exemption, it's empowerment. But Nagy did this one family at a time. How could you possibly audit an entire society's ledger? Right? That's the huge question of scale. You can't put a therapist in every school, every social work office, every single day. So how do you stop the fraudulent accounting from happening in the first place? The proposed answer is pretty wild. It's a new kind of technology that acts like a real-time auditor. It's called input constitutional AI. So imagine a support worker is typing a note. Client is stubborn. Before that note is even saved, an AI that's been trained on human rights principles audits it. It might flag the entry and ask, could this behavior be a valid exercise of autonomy rather than a personality flaw? And right in that moment, the Tobashi is blocked. The debt is correctly recorded on the institution's ledger, not the person's. So this brings us to the big payoff. Why would a society go to all this trouble?
Because this isn't about charity. It has never been about charity. Correcting the ledger is a fundamental, restorative obligation. And, as it turns out, it's also one of the smartest investments a society can possibly make.
So researchers actually calculated the social return on investment for this approach. And for every single dollar spent, society gets back nearly $30. That is not a typo. Hedge funds would kill for that kind of return. And the math behind it is surprisingly simple. By investing upfront to correct the books and restore a person's rights, you prevent all these staggering downstream costs, lifelong dependency, ER visits, the criminal justice system. You actually help people transition from being dependent on the system to becoming active participants, taxpayers, and contributors. And this all connects to the ultimate goal. When the social ledger is so broken for someone that they feel completely discarded, they get to a point where they have nothing left to lose. They become, in a sense, invincible, because the normal rules and deterrents of society just don't apply to them anymore. Correcting the books is about giving them a stake in society again, a life so precious that the thought of losing it becomes a reason to reconnect. Which leaves us with one final, big question to chew on. Ivan Bazormaninag gave us a lens to see the invisible debts in our closest relationships. But if we apply that same lens to our entire society, what other injustices, what other crises that we've all written off as unsolvable are actually just waiting for an honest audit? What unpayable debts out there are really just bad accounting?